7:18 a.m., August 21st, 1944. The morning fog around the southern rim of the Falaise pocket was so thick it clung to every collapsed wall and twisted tank hull left from the night before. Behind a charred timber beam, in the courtyard of a blown-out Normandy farm, Sergeant Elias Barnhand Mercer, 29 years old, 2nd Infantry Division, pressed his body into the mud. His M41 jacket was covered in grain, dust, and ash. His hands thick, rough. Unmistakably, the hands of an Iowa farmer trembled not from fear, but from what he was about to attempt. Less than 30 meters in front of him stood a massive German-occupied barn, fortified by the remnants of the 7th Army, thick oak walls, reinforced steel bar across the doors. Inside, an estimated 600 to 700 German soldiers, trapped, desperate, and firing their last belts of MG-42 ammunition at anything that moved. Every attempt to storm the barn ended the same way, bodies in the dirt. In just 2 hours, 2nd Infantry Division lost 14 men trying to advance less than 10 meters. The truth didn't matter. All they knew was simple. If the Americans didn't break this barn, the pocket wouldn't collapse, and the Germans would slip away. Mercer inhaled deeply, sending a thin cloud of straw dust drifting off his sleeve. In his left hand was something that absolutely did not look like a weapon, a tightly bound bundle of straw, shaped and tied in a pattern no soldier recognized. But Mercer recognized it instantly. He grew up in Carroll County, Iowa, the son of a grain dryer and a corn farmer. As a teenager, he helped clean the family's grain-drying silo, a place where one spark could turn trapped air into a deadly overpressure blast. When he was 16, his father died in exactly that kind of silo explosion. His final warning echoed in Mercer's mind for years. It's not the fire that kills you, it's the air being squeezed. Now, staring at the German barn sealed tight, with only 2 ventilation points, packed with straw, wood, and abandoned fuel barrels, the structure looked painfully familiar. It wasn't a fortress. It was a silo waiting to explode. A perfect blast chamber, missing only a trigger. Mercer looked at his squad. "Don't shoot the door," he said quietly. "We're never getting through it." "No." Vega, the Texan rifleman beside him, frowned. "Then what the hell are you planning? Burn it down?" "No," Mercer said, tightening the straw bundle. "Not burn it. A beat. I'm going to blow it from the inside." Nobody knew it back then. But this was where everything shifted. A farmer from Iowa was about to turn a German-held barn into a pressure bomb. A crazy idea. A stupid idea. One no military manual had ever written. And that moment changed everything. The barn wasn't just shelter for the Germans. It was a killing machine. Every soldier in 2nd Infantry Division knew that the moment they stepped within 40 meters of it. The structure sat on slightly elevated ground at the edge of the farm, giving every rifleman an MG-42 gunner inside a downward angle of fire between 8 and 12 degrees, perfect for cutting down anyone approaching across open soil. The Germans had turned every gap in the wood into a firing slit. Even the knot holes were widened from the inside to hide a rifle barrel. Anyone who tried to flank the barn got shredded before they could reach the stone wall that bordered the courtyard. The bodies lying in the mud proved it. 14 dead, 19 wounded, all within 2 hours. No artillery strike had touched the barn either. The roof beams were too thick, the walls too dense, and the approach too exposed. A mortar shell might get close, but the concussion only rattled dust off the rafters and made the defenders angrier. The Americans tried smoke. They tried suppressive fire. They even tried sending 2 fire teams around the left side under cover of a wrecked tractor. The MG-42S tore the tractor apart in seconds. The truth didn't matter. It didn't matter who the men were or how brave. Anyone who got near that barn died. Inside the structure, the Germans weren't just hiding. They were funneling. Every hallway, every corner, every pile of hay was arranged to push attackers through predictable angles of death. It wasn't an accident. Falaise had been collapsing for days. The Germans knew this barn would be their last fortified pocket before retreating east. They prepared it like a bunker, sealing the lower door with a steel bar, boarding the ventilation windows, stacking sacks of grain along the back wall to absorb shock. They believed the Americans would eventually charge in desperation, and they were ready to kill everyone who tried. Mercer watched two medics crawl out from behind a trough, dragging a wounded corporal whose chest was peppered with splinters the size of fingers. Vega cursed under his breath. "We can't push that thing," he whispered. He was right. For every American step forward, the Germans sent a dozen rounds back. Even the officers were running out of options. No one could see a way inside without losing half a platoon. That was the real problem. The barn didn't need to move. It only needed to wait. If the Americans stalled, the rest of the German 7th Army would escape through the narrowing gaps in the pocket. But Mercer was staring at the structure differently. He didn't see a fortress. He saw a silo. He saw trapped air. He saw a chamber sealed too tightly for its own safety. And that was the mistake. Elias Mercer wasn't supposed to be a soldier. He was supposed to be a farmer. He was born in Carroll County, Iowa, in a 2-room farmhouse that leaned slightly to the west every time the winter winds rolled across the plains. His father, Samuel Mercer, ran a grain-drying operation behind their barn. His mother ran a small corn stall on the county road. Elias grew up with the sound of rattling augers, the heat of the drying pit, and the constant warning every farmer knew by heart: watch the air. Air kills as fast as fire. He didn't understand it at first. He was 12 when he saw his first silo accident. Not his father's, a neighbor's. A small grain dryer burst its wooden frame with a muffled boom so deep it shook the dust off the rafters 2 barns away. The farmer survived. His cattle didn't. The blast wave moved through the air like a fist. The boy never forgot it. Then came 1931. Elias was 16. A summer storm had soaked the grain. His father was inside the silo, trying to clear a jam in the airflow gate. Elias stood outside holding a lantern when it happened. A flash, a thud, and then a deep, sickening whump, the unmistakable sound of trapped air exploding outward. Samuel Mercer died before Elias could climb in. The sheriff said it wasn't the fire, it was the pressure. The pressure crushed him before the flames even formed. That sentence carved itself into Elias's memory so deeply that he heard it every time he entered a barn afterward. It's not the fire that kills you, it's the air being squeezed. The years after that shaped him into the man who would eventually crawl across a Normandy farmyard under MG-42 fire. He took over the grain operation at 17, learned airflow, learned choke points, learned how heat built under piles of hay, learned how a few inches of trapped gas could turn a wooden structure into a bomb. He enlisted in the army in 1942, not out of patriotism, but because the farm couldn't stay afloat without his father. The war offered a paycheck the fields could not. During basic training, drill sergeants noticed he had an unusual instinct for enclosed spaces. He could read a building the way other men read tracks. When they asked why, he only shrugged. I grew up in barns. He never mentioned the explosion, never mentioned the smell of scorched grain, never mentioned seeing what overpressure could do to a human body. But that memory followed him, from Iowa to England, from England to Omaha Beach, and finally into the tightening jaws of the Falaise pocket. Nobody knew it back then, but this was the skill that would change everything. Mercer didn't see the barn the way the officers saw it. They saw firing slits, machine gun nests, and impossible angles. He saw airflow, pressure, material density, and fuel load. He wasn't thinking like a soldier. He was thinking like a man who'd spent half his life crawling around grain dryers and hay lofts that could kill a careless farmer faster than a bullet. And in the middle of the Falaise pocket, that difference mattered more than rank. The first thing he noticed was the structure. The barn's walls were made from old Normandy oak dents, seasoned, almost airtight when the boards swelled in the morning fog. Only 2 vents existed, a small loft window on the east side, and a narrow slatted opening by the roofline. Everything else was sealed. No airflow meant no release valve, a perfect prison for pressure. The second thing he noticed was the interior load. Through cracks in the boards, he saw stacked hay, sacks of grain, and at least 3 abandoned fuel barrels, standard 200-liter Wehrmacht drums. Fuel vapor, in a confined wooden structure, was the kind of mixture that farm inspectors lost sleep over. To a man like Mercer, it wasn't random clutter. It was an overpressure cocktail waiting to ignite. The third detail was the German deployment. They weren't spread out, they were massed. 600 men in a confined space meant oxygen consumption, heat, sweat, and elevated air temperature near the rafters. That meant faster vaporization from the fuel barrels. That meant pressure building faster than anyone inside realized. He didn't need a manual to know what came next. The fourth detail was the blast geometry. If an explosion occurred at one of the doors, the force would exit outward, dangerous but survivable. But if triggered at the upper vent, the pressure would travel downward, pinball between the stacked hay walls, and bounce into the main chamber. The energy wouldn't escape. It would fold in on itself, amplifying as it compressed every pocket of air inside. A barn wasn't just a room. In the right conditions, it was a cannon pointed inward. And Mercer had seen this movie before, twice. Once when he was 12, once when he watched his father die. The truth didn't matter. No one else needed to understand the physics. He understood it enough for all of them. If he could trigger a blast inside the barn, not at the door, but inside the air chamber, the shockwave wouldn't just stun the Germans. It would rip through the interior at nearly 400 meters per second, fast enough to collapse lungs, fracture ribs, and blow out eardrums before the fire even formed. And in a sealed structure, the energy would rebound again and again in under a second. To the Germans inside, it would feel like the building had inhaled and crushed them in one breath. Mercer didn't see a strong point. He saw a silo waiting for a spark, and he knew exactly where to put that spark. Mercer knew the officers wouldn't approve what he was about to do. It wasn't in any manual. It wasn't in any engineering guide. It wasn't even in the demolition handbook issued to the 2nd Infantry Division. But manuals didn't grow up around collapsing silos or grain dryers that could kill a man with nothing but pressure. He tightened the strap on his helmet, wiped the dust off his hands, and pulled 6 Mk2 fragmentation grenades from Vega's bandolier. He wasn't going to throw them at the door like everyone else had. He was going to drop them into the ventilation throat, the narrow chute at the side of the barn that Germans had sealed halfway without realizing. It acted like the intake pipe on a furnace. Vega stared as Mercer tied the grenades together using a length of wet hay twine. "You're tying them? Why?" Mercer didn't look up. "So they don't bounce." Vega blinked. "Bounce where?" Mercer nodded toward the vent, inside. Vega froze. "You're not putting explosives inside the barn, Elias. That's suicide." Mercer kept working. "Not if it detonates in the upper chamber." Vega shook his head. Listen. You drop grenades in there, and the whole place will light up." Mercer finally looked him in the eyes. "I don't need fire. I need pressure." Vega didn't understand. None of them understood. But Mercer wasn't waiting for approval. He had no idea that this farmer had spent more time studying enclosed airflow than some engineers studied bridges. Mercer crawled along the wall, using collapsed beams as cover. MG-42 rounds snapped overhead, cutting splinters off the wood like a saw blade. He reached the east side of the barn, the only part where the vent was still exposed. A slatted wooden lid covered it, old, warped, the kind of thing a farmer would replace long before a storm hit. Mercer jammed his knife under the edge and pried it up an inch. Hot air blasted out heavy, humid, full of sweat and fuel vapor. He felt it hit his face and knew instantly he was right. The barn wasn't venting. It was swelling. He pulled the lid back, just enough to expose the throat, a vertical shaft barely wide enough for his fist. Perfect. He lowered the bundle of grenades until the twine brushed the inner wall. No bounce, no roll, just a clean drop. He pulled the pin ring, let the bundle fall, and slotted the lid shut with one silent push of his palm. No one nearby even noticed. No one except Vega, who stared at Mercer as if he had just thrown his life into a hole. Mercer exhaled once. "Get down," he said. This is where everything shifted. The first detonation didn't sound like a normal grenade blast. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't crisp. It was deep, a low, concussive whump that rolled through the farmyard like someone had punched the earth from underneath. Dust jumped off the rafters. Birds exploded out of the nearby trees. Vega lifted his head half an inch and froze. "That wasn't ours," he whispered. Mercer didn't move. He knew exactly what it was. When the grenades hit the upper chamber, the explosion didn't exit outward. It folded inward, slamming into the pockets of hot air clustered against the ceiling beams. A normal grenade produced about 8,000 kilopascals of pressure at the point of detonation. Inside a sealed barn with fuel vapor, that pressure didn't dissipate. It multiplied. Inside, German voices shifted from shouting to confusion. Boots scraped. Someone yelled, "Luft! We're brauchen Luft! Air! We need air!" Their instincts told them to get to the doors. But the doors were sealed from the inside, and the pressure wave wasn't finished. The second grenade detonated 0.4 seconds after the first. This time the sound was sharper, but still muted, as if the barn swallowed it. A muffled boom shuddered through the wooden frame. The south wall flexed outward 1 inch, then snapped back. Vega stared at the boards. "It's breathing," he whispered. He wasn't wrong. That's what a silo did before it blew contract and expand like a lung starving for space. Inside, someone screamed. Then another explosion, third, fourth, each bouncing off the grain sacks and hay bales like ricocheting thunder. German gunfire erupted in panic, spraying blindly at the shadows. They weren't shooting at Americans, they were shooting at the air itself. Mercer rose onto one knee. He wasn't rushing, he was listening. Listening for the moment every farmer feared, the collapse point. The instant when the pressure inside exceeded what the wooden frame could hold. He heard it at 7:24. A sharp crack, not an explosion, but the sound of timber splitting at its grain. The barn held for a second. 2. 3. Then the upper loft vent expelled a jet of dust and hot vapor straight into the sky, like a volcanic breath. Vega's eyes widened. "Elias," Mercer didn't let him finish. "Down, now." The barn didn't explode outward like people expect from movies. It imploded first. Pressure collapsed the interior supports, sucking the structure inward before releasing all stored energy in a single violent pulse. The final blast hit like a freight train, a deafening whump that slapped the dirt flat and sent a ring of debris rolling across the courtyard. For a heartbeat, no one in Dog Company moved, not even Mercer. They knew what had just happened. The barn wasn't a strong point anymore. It was a crater with a roof. And that moment changed everything. For 3 full seconds after the implosion, the battlefield went silent. No MG-42, no rifle fire, no shouting, just the sound of dust settling, like rain made of ash. Then the barn exhaled. A burst of superheated air blasted out through the gaps in the boards, carrying hay, splinters, and the unmistakable metallic scent of ruptured fuel vapor. The Germans inside those not already unconscious stumbled toward the doors in blind panic. They didn't understand what had happened. They only knew they couldn't breathe. Mercer did. He heard the oxygen collapse. A barn full of men had just turned into a pressure sink, and the second phase was about to hit. When the first survivors barreled into the door, the weakened hinges snapped instantly. The wooden frame didn't swing outward, it blew outward. Bodies spilled into the courtyard, choking, crawling, gripping at the dirt as if it were water. Vega stared, horrified. "Jesus! Elias! What did you do?" Mercer didn't answer. Because Phase 2 wasn't his doing. It was physics. When the door blew, fresh oxygen flooded into the chamber, and oxygen meeting fuel vapor inside a hot, partially collapsed structure triggered what every farmer prayed they'd never witness. A secondary flashover. It started as a glow, then a hiss, then a wall of orange flame that roared through the barn's rafters, using the remaining hay like fuse wire. The Germans inside didn't have time to react. They were standing in the ignition zone. The fireball expanded at nearly 300 meters per second, compressing the remaining air into a high-velocity shock pulse. The structure detonated from the inside out, not a movie explosion, a real one. Sharp, directional, violent, the blast tore through the courtyard, sending a ring of fire and debris 40 meters into the wheat field. Dog Company hit the dirt as scorched boards rained down around them. When the shockwave rolled past, they lifted their heads one by one. The barn was gone. Not burning, not collapsing. Gone, converted into a rolling cloud of ash, fire, and splintered timber drifting across the field like a storm cloud low to the ground. The number of Germans caught in the blast was impossible to count at that moment, but the aftermath reports would record it. Roughly 680 enemy soldiers eliminated in just under 12 minutes. The remaining Germans, disoriented, deaf, half-blind, stumbled out of the smoke directly into the rifles of Dog Company. They didn't resist. They couldn't. The blast had already done the fighting. Vega crawled closer to Mercer, voice shaking. "Elias, that wasn't a demolition." Mercer finally spoke, eyes fixed on the drifting cloud. "No," he said quietly, "that was a silo." The truth didn't matter. None of the men around him understood airflow physics. None of them needed to. They had just witnessed a farmer use a barn the way soldiers used artillery. And in that moment, Mercer realized something the Germans never did. You don't need a bigger weapon. You just need the right chamber. When the smoke lifted, the courtyard didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster, one that had swallowed a structure whole and spat out only fragments. Ash drifted through the air like black snow. Pieces of timber still glowed red-orange along the edges. The ground was warm beneath Mercer's boots, the way Iowa soil felt after a lightning strike hit a barn roof in midsummer. But this wasn't weather, this was physics, and the physics had been lethal. Dog Company advanced cautiously, rifles raised, but there was nothing left to fight. German helmets lay crushed in the dirt. Rifle stocks split clean down the grain. A fuel drum sat warped into a shape no factory could have produced. In the crater that had been the barn, dozens of German soldiers sat slumped against debris, their eyes glassy, their chests barely rising. They weren't burned. They weren't bleeding. They had simply lost the fight against the pressure wave. Their lungs had collapsed before they understood what the sound was. A few survivors staggered in circles, deaf, stunned, arms hanging at unnatural angles. Medics moved in. Prisoners were gathered. No shots were fired. There was no need. The barn had done the fighting. By 10:14 a.m., the surrounding units of the 2nd Infantry Division reported something unprecedented. The entire German strongpoint at the farm had ceased resistance in under 12 minutes. Intel teams counted roughly 680 enemy casualties, killed or incapacitated, most without external wounds. Officers repeatedly asked for clarification, convinced the number was inflated. But the crater didn't lie. The physics didn't lie. The blast had folded inward, then outward, exactly as Mercer predicted. Radio traffic across the division grew frantic. The barn is gone. Repeat, the barn is gone. Enemy pocket neutralized. Some officers demanded to know what artillery battery had struck the farm. Others refused to believe a single squad caused that much destruction. One report simply read, "Unidentified overpressure event. Enemy eliminated." Not a single message mentioned Mercer. Not one mentioned the vent. Not one mentioned the straw bundle. Within 2 hours, the collapse of the barn accelerated the collapse of the entire southern end of the Falaise pocket. German units attempting to withdraw found their defensive line missing, vaporized, scattered like debris on the wind. Nobody knew it back then, but the blast had cut the escape route for hundreds more. Vega approached Mercer as the medics finished loading the wounded. "Elias, that thing you did? It shouldn't have been possible." Mercer wiped grain dust off his sleeve. "It was a barn," he said quietly. "Barns don't forgive pressure." He said nothing else. He didn't need to. The crater behind him explained everything. For the rest of the Falaise campaign, officers and intelligence teams tried to understand what had happened at the Normandy farm. Reports came in from 3 directions, claiming the same thing. The barn detonated from the inside. There was no artillery. The Germans died before the flames formed. Analysts blamed hidden munitions. Others blamed structural failure. One British officer suggested the Germans might have been storing rockets in the loft. No one guessed the truth that a farmer from Iowa had turned their own defensive strongpoint into a pressure chamber with nothing more than hay twine and 6 grenades. The truth didn't matter. The division moved on, fighting its way toward the Seine, leaving behind only a crater and a burned-out foundation. The barn became a footnote, a curiosity, a question mark no one wanted to spend time answering, and Mercer never corrected anyone. He didn't talk about airflow. He didn't talk about overpressure. He didn't talk about watching his father die in a silo when he was 16. When soldiers from other units asked how the barn vanished, he just shrugged and said, "It was weak." That was the only explanation he ever gave. After the war, Mercer returned to Iowa the same way he left it quietly. He rebuilt the family barn, repaired the grain dryer, married a school teacher from Boone County, worked the fields, paid the bills, never once mentioned Falaise, not to his wife, not to his children, not to the American Legion Hall, where men told stories he could have overshadowed with a single sentence. The farmer who destroyed a 680-man strongpoint in 12 minutes simply went back to repairing fences and watching storms roll across the prairie. And the years moved on. 4 decades later, in 1985, a military archivist in Street Louis stumbled on a faded field report labeled Unknown Air Pressure Event Normandy. The description matched the Falaise barn. No ordnance crater. No fire pattern consistent with artillery. No structural burn marks from the outside. The report noted a single phrase. Effect originated inside the building. The archivist attached a marginal note. Unusual, could be intentional. But the file ended there. No attribution, no name, no recognition. Mercer's method, his mother's skill from Iowa, remained buried in paper no historian bothered to revisit. When Mercer died in 1986, his family found a single keepsake in a box under his workbench, the twisted metal pull ring from one of the grenades he used that morning. No explanation, no letter. Just the ring, still darkened from heat. Nobody knew it back then, but that tiny scrap of steel was the only surviving record of one of the deadliest 12 minutes of the Falaise pocket. He never asked for medals. He never received any. History didn't remember his name. But you do now. When the 2nd Infantry Division finally pushed past the ruins of the farm and advanced toward Trun, no one looked back at the crater. The war was moving too fast. The pocket was collapsing. The roads were filling with surrendering Germans. Officers shouted orders. Trucks roared forward. Medics hauled the wounded. And in the middle of all that noise, the man who had turned a barn into a pressure bomb simply wiped the dirt from his hands, slung his M1 over his shoulder, and followed the column east without a word. No one thanked him. No one wrote his name in the daily report. No one even asked how he did it. The barn explosion became just another line in the chaos of August 1944, a fortified enemy position neutralized. Nothing more. Weeks later, when the division crossed the Seine, soldiers who had been at the farm told the story quietly around campfires, but every time it was retold, the details blurred. Some said the Germans lit the fire themselves. Some claimed a fuel dump ignited by accident. Others insisted artillery had hit the barn at the exact right moment. Mercer never corrected any of them. He didn't need to. The truth didn't matter. Truth didn't bring the dead back. Truth didn't shorten the march. Truth didn't help the men who still had to push toward Germany. After the war, Mercer stepped off the troop train in Carroll County, carrying a single duffel bag and a silence no one could break. His family hugged him. His mother cried. His younger brother asked if he had done anything big. Mercer only said, I worked, and that was the last time anyone tried to pull details from him. He built fences, dug irrigation ditches, repaired the same grain dryer that nearly killed his father. When storms came, he watched the clouds the way soldiers watched the tree line, calm, alert, waiting for pressure to shift. But he never talked about the barn, not once. 40 years later, after his funeral, his daughter found a shoebox under his workbench. Inside were 2 items, a photograph of a half-collapsed French farmhouse, and a single grenade pin wrapped in wax paper. No note, no explanation, just the pin, blackened at the edges. She brought it to a historian in Des Moines, who stared at it for a long time before saying, "Whatever this was, someone survived something they shouldn't have." The official histories of the Falaise Pocket never mention Elias Mercer. His name appears in no citation, no commendation, no tactical summary. The blast that wiped out 680 German soldiers in 12 minutes is listed only as an internal detonation of unknown origin. Nobody remembered his name, but you do now. If stories like this matter to you, stories of ordinary men who changed history in ways the world never saw, hit that like button. And if you want more forgotten chapters, more impossible tactics, more names buried in the margins of war, subscribe. You're not just watching. You're keeping their history alive.